Lecture 28 is called Rebellion and Reaction, and this is a time that America in the 1960s was still growing economically. Kennedy, of course, said that by the end of the decade we will put a man on the moon, and this was all part of that space race with the Soviet Union to see who could get there first. And Kennedy's plan was called New Frontier because he saw great possibilities by going into space. But like I say, I think the biggest reason was because he wanted to beat the Russians at that game. 1962, John Glenn would be the first astronaut to circumvent the Earth. He went 3 times around in a little under 5 hours, and he was part of that Mercury Original 7 astronaut program, and moved into the Gemini program, and then Apollo, which eventually would put us on the moon. A lot of people didn't think we'd ever get to the moon, but of course in 1969 in July we finally made it when we had Neil Armstrong, the first astronaut to walk on the moon. We've had 12 astronauts walk on the surface of the moon in 6 different Apollo missions during that time. The first, of course, man, like I mentioned, was Neil Armstrong in 1969. I remember a story of Gaylord Perry, a Major League Baseball pitcher who was a horrible hitter, said at one time that they'll probably put a man on the moon before I hit a home run. And the story goes that in July that year they did put a man on the moon, and 2 hours later in a baseball game, Gaylord Perry hit his first home run. So you might want to fact check that one, but that's one that I've heard and always get a little humor out of that. But John Glenn certainly was a American hero. Died in December 2016 from Ohio, 95 years old. He was married to his wife for 73 years, and John Glenn was not only went into orbit in 1962 and went around the Earth 3 times, but at age 77 went back into space again. He served as a senator from Ohio for 30-some years, ran for president actually at one time for the Democratic nomination. And I remember a story about Glenn when his wife and family used to get nervous when he went to fly, and he used to just tell them he's going to the corner store for a pack of gum. He'll be right back. And that kind of, I guess, eased their stress a little bit. Once he got back, he was actually offered $5 million to be on the cover of a Wheaties cereal box, and he turned it down, and he said, nobody should make money off the government. And I think just that one act alone makes me love this guy. I mean, I think John Glenn was certainly a good example for us to follow. When Kennedy was in office, he had an idea that we should help in other countries, and he organized a group called the Peace Corps, where people would volunteer to go help in many times third world countries. 1962, Michael Harrington wrote a book called The Other America, and it dealt with poverty, and this kind of showed Americans just how poor that the other half was. And this is something that eventually Lyndon Johnson's going to really attack with his Great Society program. We also had people were concerned about the environment. Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, which dealt with insecticides and DDT and the dangers on the environment. We had civil rights movement, which was still going on big time in the 1950s and 60s. In 1964, Johnson would sign the Civil Rights Act, which said no segregation allowed in public places. We Shall Overcome became I guess, the unofficial mantra, the song that many people sang as they marched. there were really two schools of thought during this civil rights time. We had Malcolm X on one side, who favored the Black Power movement and separation of races. And on the other side, we had Martin Luther King, who in 1964 won a Nobel Peace Prize and was part of the big March on Washington in 1963 to try to get the Civil Rights Act passed. King felt that integration was the answer, and that people needed to learn to live together and get along. And like I said before, his death came way too soon at age 39 in 1968. We had in California Cesar Chavez, who, and if you get a chance to see the movie, I think it's maybe on Netflix or one of the Amazon Prime or Redbox or somewhere where you guys watch movies, you can maybe find the Cesar Chavez movie. But he's an interesting guy. He led the labor movement for farm workers in the migrants in the fields in California and other places. And this was kind of a big deal because they actually went on strike. And in the end, the conditions did get better for many of the workers. Johnson had success. His domestic programs dealt with education and health care and the poor, clean water and things like that. But like I said earlier in another discussion, that what hurt Johnson a little bit was the fact the Vietnam War was going on, and a lot of the money went to that. 1968, Johnson would bow out. Remember, in the election, Goldwater would run as a Republican against in 1964 against Johnson, and in 1968 he was there was a Daisy Girl commercial that tried to make Johnson look pretty tough against the opponent in that election. We had the New Left coming up during this time. They were against the war and would march on a regular basis often on college campuses. The Warren Court, Earl Warren was the court had a liberal stance. We had several cases like Brown versus Board, of course, in the 1950s. We had Gideon and Wainwright, which dealt with free legal counsel for people that were charged with felony. We had the Miranda case, which said that people they were arrested and had to have their rights read to them and a lawyer present. The Loving case, which said that interracial marriage was legal. Up until that time, many states banned it. And we had the Engel versus Vitale case, which dealt with school prayer. It outlawed school prayer in the 1960s. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965, which said that you couldn't use literacy or poll taxes anymore for a requirement to be able to vote. A couple things before we close down to think about. One is we banned school prayer in public schools, but there's still a moment of silence, which some schools call a minute of silence, which goes on for anywhere from 15 seconds to a minute. Is this a good idea, bad idea, waste of time? Another way to make it look like prayer is actually going on? Do kids actually pray during this time? And secondly, we look at the space program. We haven't been back to the moon, although there's some talk that in the future maybe we should go to faraway planets like Mars, set up colonies eventually there. Should the government be in the business of launching spaceships into space, or is this too risky and too expensive? Maybe send robots into space now, because we have had some sad endings to some of these launches, like the Challenger in 1986. So something to think about. There's a star.